Tonight we'll be covering the second part of Shabbat, reviewing some of the concepts that we spoke about last week. They're important to review because they have several applications. The first one is En Bishul Achar Bishul. It's an important concept in Shabbat, that ordinarily something that was already cooked, recooking it, does not contribute anymore to the food, to the piece of chicken or whatever it might be. So therefore there's no transgression, there's no Isur on Shabbat, Midoraita, according to the Torah, to recook something. There are problems, of course, with the Rabbanan, that the rabbis decreed that we should not recook or rewarm food for several reasons. But as far as the Torah is concerned, one does not transgress that prohibition of Bishul by recooking it. This halakha, according to some opinions, applies to whether this is something solid or something liquid. And Bishul Achar Bishul means just that. Once the water has been raised to boiling point, that it's been cooked, then even though it's cooled down, been cooked already once, and Bishul Achar Bishul, we are mahmir. We follow the stricter opinion that even though there's no Bishul Achar Bishul b'davar yavesh, when something is dry, if it comes to liquid, because liquid that has cooled down, when you're recooking it, you are performing a very similar function. You're making a difference. In other words, the difference that is visible, that is observable in a solid, is cooked. It's not visible, it's not observable in a liquid. Once something has cooled down, you can't tell if it's cooked or not. Liquid is definitely different than a solid, and we follow the stricter opinion that something that has cooled down, if it's a liquid or liquid form, it cannot be recooked, and as far as we're concerned, it cannot be rewarmed. So let me just review that point. There is a difference in that one area between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and here the Sephardim, those who follow the Sephardic tradition, are stricter than Ashkenazim. Now, if you're a Temani, and you follow the Rambam, depending which tradition of Teman you follow, they are lenient even with liquids. In other words, they follow the opinion of En Bishul Achar Bishul applies across the board to everything. With the Sephardim and Ashkenazim, you just make a difference how much the liquid has cooled down. According to the Ashkenazi tradition, we are lenient in that if it has cooled down a little bit, but it's still lukewarm, then you can rewarm it. Even if it in the end starts cooking again, right? It goes over the Yad Soledet point, which is the point that we said that the hand, does not want to touch the liquid. That's the point that we're concerned with. That if the liquid reaches that point, it's almost like we're cooking it. So as long as it's lukewarm, you can rewarm it. The Sephardic tradition says that no, once it's no longer Yad Soledet bo, if it's cooled down, you cannot rewarm it. Both would agree, except for the Temanim, that if it has cooled down completely, you put away the chicken soup in the refrigerator from Friday night, and you want to rewarm it on Shabbat day, right? We're not talking about recooking everything. We're talking about even rewarming. The problem with rewarming is that if it reaches a certain point, it's like you're recooking it. So we need to know this halakha. Is there Bishul Achar Bishul b'davar lach or not? Since we're talking about something which is liquid form, chicken soup, or the like, if it's in the refrigerator, nobody would permit it. You would not be able to put it anywhere if that spot where you're putting it will reach Yad Soledet bo. If it's only going to get a little bit warm, room temperature, just a little bit, that's okay. Right? But if it's going to become Yad Soledet bo, then that liquid, according to everybody except for the Temanim, cannot be rewarmed. No. Temanim are Temanim. Some people consider them part of the Edot HaMizrach, the community that but in many, many ways they're very different. The pronunciation, the prayer, they follow only the Rambam for the most part. So they're a class of their own. Yes. Right, that's a good question. Right. If you have solid food that has a little bit, just a drop, a little bit of its own gravy, that's still considered davar yavesh, as long as it's not a considerable amount. We're not talking about lots and little. It has to be a good amount of liquid. If you have meatballs in their sauce, then you have a considerable amount of sauce, which is liquid form. That would fall under the liquid category, even though you're having solids there too. But what can you do? You have liquid there too. But if it's something that has its own gravy or fat, like chicken, it has a little bit of liquid of its own fat or oils, then that would fall under the category of yavish, solid. There are permissible ways of rewarming that. And even in that area, we'll talk about it when we talk about Hazara. There's a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And in this area, Sephardim are more lenient. How to rewarm solid. But liquid is more of a difficult situation because if it has cooled off completely, unless you're from Tamani tradition, you cannot warm it up to the point of Yatzoledet on Shabbat. Question is, if something has not cooled off, then it depends if you follow the Ashkenaz tradition or the Sephardic tradition. The Sephardic are more strict in that situation, that once something has cooled off, you cannot put it back somehow in a place where it's going to warm up to be Yatzoledet on. So we gave examples last week with tea that has cooled off, all sorts of situations where this may apply. I could think of many, but you just have to be aware that if it's a liquid, you cannot easily rewarm. So when we talk about rewarming in Chazara, just remember the difference between lach and yavesh. There is a big difference. Another concept is bishul achar tzli or tzli achar bishul. Even though in bishul achar bishul, there are quite a few opinions that hold that one does transgress the prohibition of bishul or cooking if he fries it, roasts it after it has been cooked. You have boiled chicken. Boiled chicken, that means the chicken that was cooked in the soup. It's been boiled, it was cooked. You have to be careful not to roast it. Even though it's been cooked already, according to some opinions, roasting it transforms it to something else. Baking it is also, according to this opinion, asur. Or the other way around. It's been baked, fried, or roasted. One may not be able to cook it. There's a question of what frying is. Is frying closer to cooking or closer to roasting? Because there's very little liquid in the frying pan. So we are strict about it. Right? We're careful with it. There's also a question about something called sli kedar, something that was cooked in its own juice. It's in a pot, it has no water, but it's in a pot, and it was cooked in its own juice. What do you call that? It resembles much more bishul, because it's in its own pot, even though it doesn't have that much water, it has its own juice, but it resembles the cooking process. Nevertheless, we are careful when it comes to bishul achar tzli or tzli achar bishul, not to do it. As an example, a chicken that was boiled chicken that was cooked, you would not be able to put it in a spot where it will become roasted. Now that's tzli achar bishul. For example, bread has been baked. You would not be able to put that piece of bread in the pot of hot soup that was just removed from the fire. That pot of soup that was just removed from the fire, and obviously if it's on the fire for sure not, but even if it was removed from the fire, it's called a kli rishon. It still is the original pot. It's still, as long as it's still boiling hot, it's considered kli rishon. And you cannot put in anything into that pot. You cannot add spice to it, and you cannot even put challah. Even though the challah was baked, we're concerned about the opinions that hold that maybe yesh afiyah achar bishul. So even though it's baked, you're cooking it now into the pot. Once that soup reaches your bowl, that bowl is already a kli sheni or maybe even a kli shlishi, depending if you use a ladle. So by the time the soup reaches your bowl, and especially if you waited a few minutes to cool down, you don't have to be concerned. You can put matzah, you can put challah, right? Some people are concerned on Pesach of not wetting the matzah for other reasons. But on Shabbat, the only issue would be to be careful. Even though, according to the Bet Yosef, we're not so strict, we don't have to be concerned with this issue. We are machmir if possible, especially if it's a kli rishon, right? Or in a situation where it will become very, very hot. So if it's the opposite, if it was once bishul and now it's going to be tzli, or if it was tzli now it's going to be bishul, you should be careful of. Unless it's a kli sheni, then you don't have to be so concerned. So this is just another idea that you should be aware of, especially when we talk about hazara, taking a boiled chicken and rewarming it. Well, how are you going to rewarm it now? Is that rewarming going to cause it to become roasted? See what I mean? So that's where this can be an issue. Bishul achar machal ben drusai, we also discussed last week that even though and bishul achar bishul, if something was only cooked partially, even though it may be edible, to the point of machal ben drusai, which some say is a third or some say is a half, if you take that piece of chicken or that piece of food that was before Shabbat only cooked in machal ben drusai, you may be transgressing the issur of bishul, even beyond this point, because you are improving it. Once upon a time it was rare, it was edible, but it was rare, and now it's going to be well done. So, from the rare to the well done, there's also a certain degree of bishul, so one has to be careful, that even in saying to himself, oh, I already cooked it. It's okay for me to rewarm it, even though it's going to become very hot. No, even though it was cooked in machal ben drusai, now it becomes well done, there's an additional bishul involved in it, it would be asur. This one I already mentioned, the tzli kedar mushar tikun, there are issues about frying, so one has to be concerned on Shabbat, even though it was cooked, it is going to be changing the way it was cooked from one form to another. These are the concepts that we covered last week, and these are important to keep in mind, especially when we talk about the halachot of Chazara. But before we go to Chazara, one of the most important halachot in Shabbat is how to prepare food before Shabbat. Not on Shabbat itself, but before Shabbat. That is where the blech, or the plata, or the cover of the fire comes into play. Once upon a time, they had ovens or stoves which used coal as a source of heat. And there was always a concern of chikui b'gechalim, that unless something is done to those coals, on Shabbat, somebody may forget, and because he may want to speed up the process of cooking, he wants it to be ready faster, he may move around the coals, may stir the coals around in order to accelerate the cooking process, and that would be a problem of bishul and possibly of mav'ir, which eventually we'll talk about. Mav'ir is the act of burning, putting fire to something. So because of that problem, there's a problem of shehiyah. Shehiyah means putting something on the stove before Shabbat, unless certain conditions are met. In order for somebody to put food on the stove before Shabbat and to allow it to cook into Shabbat, it has to be garuf v'katum. The fire has to be concealed. It has to be covered. There is a machloket, there are two opinions. How much does the food have to be cooked before Shabbat that we shouldn't have to have this concern? Once the food is fully cooked before Shabbat, we don't care that there are coals there. We're not concerned that he's going to come to move around the coals. Because it's fully cooked, why should he do that? Or if the food is completely raw, right before Shabbat, you came late from work, you threw something into the pot, there's no blech, there's no covering, but it's completely raw. It won't be ready till tomorrow. You're not going to be eating it tonight. It's raw. And your intention is for tomorrow. We're not concerned that you're going to play around with it. The only question is what happens if it's between raw and completely cooked. That is where the problem arises. It's not completely raw. It's not completely cooked. How much does it have to be that we shouldn't be concerned with it? And there's some that say it has to be k'machal ben drusai, some that say that it has to be completely cooked, and mitztamek veralo. Mitztamek veralo means that any additional cooking would only make it worse. So there are various opinions on how you can avoid covering the flame. At what point does the food have to be ready in order to avoid the problem of the flame? Since, we don't know where the food is, at what point, plus we want to be able to take the food that we just took off the flame and be able to put it back on the flame, sometimes on Shabbat, we need to cover the fire. So the covering of the fire accomplishes two things. It allows us to keep food Friday afternoon before Shabbat on top of the flame. It takes away the concern that we're not going to play around with the flame, regardless of what level of cooking the food has reached. In other words, whether it's fully cooked, undercooked, raw. Once the flame is covered, we're not afraid we're going to play around with the coals or with the knobs. Today we have knobs, right? There's a heker. There's something there to remind us that it's Shabbat. So that takes care of the problem of shehiyah, covering the fire on Shabbat. Today we use a blech, a piece of metal. That's what that accomplishes. It takes away this concern, and it allows us to keep the food there Friday afternoon, regardless of how much the food was cooked. That is one of the accomplishments, one of the advantages. The second advantage is that it will allow us something called hazara. I'm jumping to it temporarily. In other words, if you took off something from the fire on Shabbat to serve, you cannot just put it back on the fire. That is because there is a problem of mara'it ayin. Anytime you take something, even if it's fully cooked, there's no bishul lahar bishul, and you take it out from the refrigerator, it's fully cooked, you want to put it on your stove, you can't just do that. Why? Because of marit ayin. It appears as though you're cooking. This is the Rabbanan Asur, and even if it was there, it's not in the fridge, it's there already, but you took it off, you removed it completely, you put it away, you put it on the table. Now you decide, well, I want to put it back. You can't just do that. Because of nifzikim mevashelit, it appears that you're cooking. There's a problem of marit ayin. And if the fire is covered, you would be able to do so if we comply with certain conditions. But if the fire is not covered at all, there's no way in the world that you could ever put it back. If somebody, let's say, says, well, my food is completely cooked. I am already fully prepared for Shabbat at noon Friday. I don't need this blech. That's true. In reality, you don't have the problem of shehiyah because it's fully cooked completely many hours before Shabbat, which is even better. Okay, fine. Let's say he doesn't have a blech. Go ahead and do that. The problem is that if he removes it from the fire on Shabbat, even if he's holding it, even if he's a few inches away, you can no longer put it back on the flame. So just for Chazara alone, it pays to cover the fire. You will see Chazara has many other advantages. There are ways that you can warm food on it, according to some opinions. Yes?
Not
Right. Oh, okay. That's all right. That's not a real fire. That's okay. That's not a problem. The pilot is okay. Okay? So there are quite a few advantages. One is for Shehiyah, in order for the food to be able to be there before Shabbat. You don't know if it's fully cooked or not. It needs to be covered. Plus, it helps us with Chazarah. Now, that is only good for the stove. What about the oven? Why? The oven is not going to be so easy. With an oven, we have two problems. One is the light. There's a thermostat. If you left the oven on Friday afternoon, right before you light candles, and you want the food to be warm, so you left it on, so when father comes home from shul, everything is still warm. What I do is I turn the oven to 350, 15 to 20 minutes before my wife lights candles. I put all the stuff that goes on top of the stove, like the soup, on high until it boils. Right before Blakat Nerot, or right about that time, close the stove, take everything, put it into the oven, and close the oven. Even though an hour and a half has gone by from the time I did that until I come home from shul, the soup is still boiling hot. And I turned off the oven before Shabbat. Yeah, I turned everything off. I don't keep it on for Shabbat. Warm, it's boiling. The soup is boiling if the soup is covered. And as long as you boil the soup before, the soup was boiling right before Blakat Nerot. You closed it. The stove was on 350 or higher for at least 15 or 20 minutes. Right? Put it into the stove and then close it. Your soup will be boiling for at least an hour and a half for sure. If you had a cover to the soup, no problem. The chicken, any other food items that you're going to eat on Friday night, you put them into the oven in their tray. They're covered with aluminum foil or whatever. That oven is hot enough to maintain the heat for a good amount of time, for sure, until you come home from shul. No problem. That's the best way to do it. Now, for those who nevertheless want to keep the oven on, doesn't make too much sense, and you'll find out, you'll see why soon. There are two problems. Problem number one is the light. Okay, you come home from shul, now you're ready to take out the food. When you take out the food, if the light is not on, there's no way for you to know when when it's going, when it's working and when it's not. If you open the door to the oven, it may be that you are causing the fire to go on because the cool air is entering. Remember the problem we have with refrigerators, with the light bulb? It's the same thing with the oven. If you open even though here it's a little bit different because you don't know for sure if it's going to go on. Nevertheless, it's a problem. It may go on no. As soon as you open the door, the cool air is going to enter, and it may turn on the oven. That's a sur. So what should you do? You can overcome that problem. That problem you can overcome. If that's your only problem, what should you do? Make sure the oven is on. The oven is working. See the light on? If you have a light, then you can tell it's working. Otherwise, you have to listen. If the oven is working, no problem. Take out, put back in, close the door. I'm sorry, don't put back in, but close back the door, right? And that's okay. The oven is on anyway. The problem with ovens is that once you've taken something out, you cannot put it back inside. You don't have the advantage of the blech, of the cover on top of the stove. You don't have that in the oven. Why? I guess we might as well talk about it right now. With an oven, that's the way you bake. That's the way you cook. You put it inside. Unless you make something that's discernible, that's different, it looks like you're baking on Shabbat when you put something back in. Just like you're putting something on the stove. What did we do? We covered the stove so it doesn't look like you're cooking exactly. Right? With the stove, what are you going to do? Even though the fire is covered, it is covered, the fire is covered. But this is the way you cook and bake during the week. So unless you put some insert or something, you line it inside in some way that it should be recognizable, that it's different in the rest of the week, you would not be able to return any food into a lit oven. The oven is not lit, but it's a little warm from before. A little, not too much. From the pilot, like I said, you want to warm up some pita or bagels. The pilot light is enough sometimes to warm up the pita or the bagel. That's okay, right? But if it's on, you cannot take something that even if it's already fully cooked and baked, you cannot put it back into the oven. So you have a problem with hazara into an oven, which you do not have on the stove if the stove is covered. Right, you would have to have an insert, some sort of insert. Something that's discernible, something that one can see that you did that's different from the rest of the week, right? Then it becomes like a blech on top of the stove. Some people have an insert that they put inside. But you don't need this. The only time you may want to have this is if you're a Temani, you're making Jahnon. The Temani makes something called Jahnon. Jahnon takes 24 hours to make, or more. No, not this. It's a lot too much. It's a lot too much. Leave it on a low flame and then leave it overnight. So you want the oven on all the time. So that's okay. That's when you would want to leave the oven until the next day. If that's what you want to have. You want it to cook for a long time in an oven. Otherwise, on Shabbat day, today we have the advantage of using crock pots and all sorts of other things. So we don't need the oven for Shabbat day. The only time you need perhaps the oven is for Friday night. Well, for Friday night you can do what I suggested. Turn on the stove to boil the soup or whatever items you have in the soup. Whatever stuff you have in the oven, warm it up, take it out, leave the oven on for 350 or higher for 20 minutes, half an hour, however much you want. Right around candle lighting time, put everything inside and then close the oven to maintain the heat very well. That's the best. If you want to leave your oven on, okay, leave it on low. Of course, don't leave it too high. You don't want your kitchen to be hot. But then you can't put anything back inside. Just remember, when you open the door, the light is on. That's all. Then it's okay to leave your oven on for Shabbat. The biggest problem with the oven is just hazara. But if you want it nevertheless, you want to keep food till tomorrow morning in the oven, you want to keep it till Friday night, late at night, you're coming home late, okay, leave it on. Just make sure when you open the door that the light is on, and just make sure you don't forget that you cannot put something back inside the way you would be able to do it on top of the blast, meaning the stove that's covered with that piece of metal. Makes no difference. Marid Ayin, once something is prohibited because of Marid Ayin, even if you're by yourself in a closet, you can't do it. That's what the rabbi said. They don't make distinctions. No. Okay, crock pot. Crock pot is similar to an oven. The fire is covered. You can't see the fire. You can't see the coils. Once you remove the insert from the crock pot, you can't put it back in, right? Unless you did something to that crock pot to make it look like the stove. Right. You put some aluminum foil or something, sure. Right? Otherwise there would be a problem. A lot of people even cover the knobs of the crock pot with aluminum foil. The knob, the low, high, or the knobs of the stove, or they remove them. So you shouldn't come to play around with it. You don't have to do that, but some people do that, just with extra caution, to cover everything completely. There are some blefs, some sheet metal that cover the entire stove, and they go over a little bit and cover the knobs too. Do that too. That's what we're going to talk about next, about how to do hazara. The problem is in a tanur or in a crock pot, in an oven or in a crock pot, those conditions that you need for returning something, placing it back in the stove, will not help you. Okay, so let's talk about hazara. Hazara means to return something to the flame, to a fire, something that was already fully cooked, that you want to rewarm, generally speaking. There are two types of hazara. One is called hazara melechatchila. Melechatchila means for the first time. Something that's been in the refrigerator. It was never on the stove on Shabbat. You cannot do it. You cannot put it on the fire. Right? That's called hazara melechatchila. Unless you're warming it. Now, if you're warming it, there's a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And I'm going to get to it soon. Let me see if I wrote it in the back. Yeah, I wrote it in the back. So we'll talk about it. But that's called hazara melechatchila. You cannot put something back on the fire, as we said before, even though it's fully cooked. However, if it's already on the fire, right, it's cooking and warming, you can also not put it back unless it's covered. That's condition number one. The fire is covered. Mevushar kol tzarko, it has been fully cooked already. You intend to put it back. In other words, you're removing it. You say, I'm going to put it back. Number three, you're still holding it. You didn't put it down. And number four, Garuga Katum, I just said, that the fire is covered. So these are the four conditions, according to Ashkenazim, that you need to comply with in order to be able to put something back on the fire. So the food has to already have been. We're not talking about food in the fridge right now. We're talking about food that has already been on the stove. So the stove has to be covered. Everybody agrees with that. Sephardim and Ashkenazim too. On condition number 4 and condition number 1, everybody agrees. Sephardim or Ashkenazim, the fire has to be covered, plus the food has to be fully cooked. The only difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim when it comes to putting something back on the stove that is covered is with the condition number 2 and 3. Do you have to have in mind to put it back? Let's say you decided, well, okay, I'm going to put it back. You just served a few people. According to the Ashkenazim, lechatchila at least, if you forgot or you weren't sure, b'di'avad it's okay, but l'chatchila, you have to have in mind taking it out but then putting it back. If you forgot it, b'di'avad it's okay. According to Sephardim, condition number 2 is not necessary. Even if you did not have in mind originally to put it back, and you decide not to put it back, it's okay. Condition number 3 is a little tricky. You have to hold it in your hand, you can't put it down. But according to the Sephardic tradition, putting it down is prohibited only if you're putting it down on the floor, on the ground. And everybody agrees that it's a problem, you can't put it back. Obviously, if you have no food for Shabbat, it's going to completely spoil. In that situation, it might be okay to put it back. But ordinarily, you have to be careful not to put the food down on the floor. The question is, are you allowed to put down on a table? Now, if it's a very heavy pot, you can't. It may be difficult not to put it down. So according to the Sephardic tradition, to put it down temporarily on a stool is not a problem if it's heavy. Ashkenazim are very careful with this, and unless something happens by accident, we realize that it is very heavy, to put it down for a minute on the table, and they can put it back. That's okay. But Nechat Chila, you have to be careful not to put it down. So these are the 4 conditions that one needs to remember. Fire has to be covered, it has to be fully cooked. Nechat Chila, you should have in mind to put it back, especially according to the Ashkenazim. And you should be careful not to put it down. Unless, for the Sephardim, if you need to put it down temporarily, 2 seconds, very heavy, on a stool, it's okay. And even for Ashkenazim, if they forgot, if they just couldn't do it by themselves, they can put it back on the fire. So we're talking about right now Hazara, taking up something that was there on Shabbat, the fire is covered, you want to put it back, you need to comply with these conditions. Otherwise, it's not covered, it's not fully cooked, you just left it, you put it away on the table for a long time, you may not be able to put it back, even if the fire is covered. Even according to the Sephardim, if you left it too long on the table and it has cooled off and it has liquid, then you can't put it back. If it has liquid, remember liquid? Yesh bishul achar bishul belach, according to some opinions. If it has cooled off and it's not hot enough, then I want it warm again, but it has liquid. So even if the fire is covered, it has liquid, it's cool, it's no longer yet soleded for. It's already cooled off, you can't put it back. According to Ashkenazim, as long as it's lukewarm, you can still put it back. The problem is you've already put it down, right? So depending on the circumstances, if you forgot or something, you may still be able to put it back. In that case, according to Ashkenazim. No, they're more lenient on the lukewarm. They're not lenient on putting it down. But obviously, if that was the only item that was missing from these 4, if you put it down by mistake, it's cooled off a little bit, it's still warm, you're still going to be able to put it back. According to the Sephardim, if it has cooled off, no longer you have to let it go, even though you may be able to return it, even if you put it down, in that case you will not be able to return it because it's cooled off. So you have to be careful not to wait too long. Most of the time, of course, when people serve, they usually put it back on the community, but sometimes people might just put it down on the counter, start serving, and by the time they come back, depending on what it is, it may have cooled off. So the Diavad means as a second choice. In other words, Mechachila means ideally, but Diavad means not ideally. In other words, you did it and you did it. Yeah.
What if you're like not in our part of home? What do? You have a different custom than the host. You have a guest.
Right.
At the Shabbat day. You follow a different custom on this. Because you said there's 2 different.
Right.
You have a guest. You have to. I can't touch it now. It's cold.
It all depends on the circumstances. Obviously one has to be concerned about the minhagim of the other 2.
Right.
But depending what it is, with some things you can be more lenient than with others. I can't tell you a blanket rule. But obviously, generally, one has to be concerned with the customs of the other when it comes to something, depending on what it is. Okay, so this is clear, right? This is what Chazara is all about. This happens every Shabbat. One has to be aware of how he can rewarm the food or put it back. We haven't talked about rewarming it. We've only spoken about putting something back that was there. Now we're going to talk about rewarming. Here there's a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim as well. We spoke about En Bishul Achar Bishul, that there are opinions that when it comes to liquids, there may be Bishul, so you have to be careful. The liquid has cooled off, you may not be able to rewarm it. So let's talk about first something that is dry. Something that's dry, everybody agrees that En Bishul Achar Bishul. The problem is that right now we're dealing with something that's dry, that's not anymore on the stove. It's been put away in the refrigerator. So it would not qualify under the rule of Hazara, right? Remember we talked about Hazara Lekatila. You can't just take something from the refrigerator. Even though this is Hazara, it's not really Hazara because it's not there on the fire right now. It's been put away in the fridge. So there's a problem of Marit Ain. Even if you're putting it on the blech. you're taking it out of the fridge and just putting it on the fire, right? However, we said that if it's dry, there's no bishul achar bishul. The question is, can I rewarm it? If it's no bishul achar bishul, it's completely dry, am I at least able to rewarm it in such a way that does not appear to be that I'm cooking? So some say, especially the Ashkenazim, that a blech, that covering on top of the fire, if you take something out of the fridge for the first time, it appears like you're cooking. So some people can cook on that. Even though ordinarily people don't cook with the fire covered, sometimes people do so. They have warmers, metal warmers, that you can cook on it too. It doesn't have to be a real flame. So it's not a very strong heker, the covering of the fire. And it only helps for Ashkenazim, for Chazara. But to take something out of the refrigerator that is dry, boiled chicken, okay, we're going back to the boiled chicken, right? And now you want to warm it. You have kugel, you have rice, anything that's completely dry. You want to warm it. According to this opinion, you cannot take out the pot or any food that you may have that's dry and put it directly over the cover of the fire. That's not a way that one can rewarm the food. According to some opinions, and only some, according to the Sephardic tradition, but not all agree with this, okay, you are able to take the dry food out of the fridge, dry food, only dry, and put it back on a fire that's covered, or on a plata. Plata is like a hot plate, but is intended to warm food, not to cook food. All it's doing is maintaining the warmth or rewarming it a little bit, not that much. So according to this opinion, you would be able to put it back on the plata or on the fire that's covered. The consensus is, however, you know what consensus means? That you should avoid taking out any foods from the refrigerator and putting it directly over the flame area. See, when you have a metal cover on top of the oven or the stove, it's usually big. Usually you may have one burner on, not necessarily all burners. So the blech itself could be hot, and it should be hot, even at the other end, the portion that's not on the fire. On that portion that's not on the fire, there are quite a few who agree that you may be able to warm up food, even if it's going to become very, very hot, as long as it was already cooked. And as long as you're not changing the form of cooking. So if it's boiled chicken, and now it's going to become roasted because of the spot you're putting it, and you can't do it. So if you're going to rewarm boiled chicken, you shouldn't do it on top of the stove. How should you do it then? How do you warm up food and avoid the problem of smiachar bishul? And be yotzei yedei chova, all the opinions. In other words, you have no problem with anybody. There are some who are strict about putting it back on the blech. You put it on top of another pot. You have a crock pot. Crock pot has its cover. You have room. You can take out from the freezer your liver, chopped liver that's frozen. You could defrost it there. It's already cooked. Take any food, chicken, aluminum foil, however you want to put it in a pot. Put it on top of the crock pot. Put it in top of another pot. Or another option is putting it karov la plata, putting it close to the blech, but not on top of the blech. Right? Then it's going to warm up over there. Nobody cooks that way. It's not directly on the flame. It's close to the flame. These last two, everybody agrees is okay. As long as it's not a liquid, you run into trouble according to everybody. Well, not according to everybody. Depending, the temanim will be okay, even with liquid. But even for Sephardim, you run into trouble if you have a dish that has liquid, has sauce. Then you cannot put it in a place where it's going to become yatz leledbo. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says that even if it has a little bit of sauce or liquid, you could put it on a spot that it's going to become yatz leledbo on condition that you remember to remove it before it becomes that hot. We're not lenient like he is. He says if you remember to take it off right before it becomes yatz leledbo, you can go ahead and rewarm it as long as you remember to remove it before it becomes that hot. We don't go by this leniency. Most of the rabbis don't agree with that. They say no, if that spot can become that hot, you don't put it there to begin with. We don't trust that you'll remember. We just don't allow it. Yes. It makes no difference. As long as it has a sauce or a liquid, it's considered davar lach. The only time that it's considered something that's considered something yavesh is if it has a little bit of its own gravy. Once something has a considerable amount of sauce, like meatballs, if there's sauce, you can see it. I mean, it's there. I mean, it's obvious that you have the sauce or the liquid floating in it. makes no difference how much it is, but it's observable, then it's considered lach, because you're cooking the lach. The only time that something is considered yavesh is that if it's completely dry, or it's a little humid because of its own gravy. It's a little bit wet, a drop maybe, it's barely noticeable, that's called yavesh, even if it has a little bit. Anytime something has an observable amount of sauce, liquid, oil, it's called lach. So you can warm it, as long as you're rewarming it in a spot where it will not become yet solidiful. Right? On top of another pot, it usually does not become yet solidiful. If you put it close to the plata, it will also not be yet solid. It will become warm. So you see, even if you follow the opinion that you're allowed to put something back on the plata or on the blech that you took out from the fridge, you have to be careful if it's in liquid. The best thing to do, that's what I tell everybody, is that either do the last two that I said, put it on top of another pot, put it close to the plata, or if you need to, you don't have a crock pot, and you need to warm something up, like chicken or something, put it at the edge of the blech, where it's not directly above the fire. Where it's not directly above the fire, you can avoid the problem of yes to let it go. And according to some opinions, it's okay, as long as it was already fully cooked, to put it on that corner, because you're not really cooking it. It's not really called hazara. Yeah. It's still mutar. Even if it's yet to let it go at the end of the blech, it would still be less of a problem than if it's directly on the flame. Because there are quite a few opinions that hold you cannot put it back directly on the flame, even if it's covered. It was sitting in the fridge. Right? Yeah, but you don't see the water anymore. And what do you want to do with it now? Since you added water, you have to be careful where you're putting it, because you don't want the water to warm up. No, it makes no difference. You can do that. But if you're going to put that rice right now in a place where it's going to become yafsaledet with the food, you're cooking it. You're cooking the water. Sure. Unless it's in a place where it's just going to be a little bit warm, then it's okay. But it makes no difference, even a drop. Even a drop. You can't cook the drop. So you can put it close to an area where it's going to become a little warm, not yafsaledet. But on the blech itself, in the covering of the blech, you want to take out a piece of chicken, or halal. You need more halos for Shabbat. In the freezer, you want to put it at the edge of the blech. That's fine. First of all, it's been baked, and now it's continuing to be baked. There's no change in the form of cooking. If it's boiled chicken, it may be a problem. Even though you may be able to put it back, if it's going to become so hot that you're roasting it now, you can't do that either. So you have to see what you're doing. Yeah. How is that one more time? Yeah. Right, I heard about it. It's a special kind of a bluff.
Right. Mine, what you told me was that you put things going on.
Yeah, not everybody agrees with that. I've read about that too. That it appears to be that it's a different kind of a bluff, and because of the way it's built, it appears to not have the same problem that a thin bluff would have. But not everybody agrees with that, so I can't really give you my opinion of that unless I saw how it works. But I've read about that, and according to some, it still poses a problem because some may warm food or cook food during the week or something like that. It's not enough of a heker, of a shinui, or something that you can recognize that's different on Shabbat. It does not appear to be like putting it on top of another pot. Everybody knows nobody cooks like that. With that, somebody might say, well, I can cook on that. So, yeah. Alright, let's say you don't have a blech, or you forgot to put a blech. And you don't have a problem of shehiyah. It was fully cooked before Shabbat. But remember what the second advantage of the blech was? Is to be able to put back the food on Shabbat. Well, if you forgot to put it, you can put it on Shabbat too. So even though you've resolved the problem of shehiyah, it's fully cooked, but now you want to take it off the fire, you won't be able to put it back on the fire if this fire is not covered. You're allowed to go ahead and put a pot, empty pot, upside down, or a plate, a metal plate obviously, upside down, or a blech on Shabbat, on that flame, so in order to enable you to take off now that pot, and be able to put it back. You know what I mean? So that can be done on Shabbat too. That's correct. In case you forgot. Because that's the advantage, the second advantage of a blech, of a fire, of covering the fire. You can put something back. But even if it's fully cooked, if you didn't cover that fire, once you remove the fire, you can never put it back, even if you're holding it.
That's tomorrow's fire.
Right, because it was already fully cooked. Sure. Okay, so the best way to rewarm food is on top of another pot, or close to the plata, or if you need to, if there's no problem of roasting versus cooking, will warm up, not directly on the flame. According to some opinions, you can put it completely dry, even on top of that, but the consensus is not to do that. The consensus is not to put anything directly back on the flame, even if the flame is covered, if it was in the fridge. And especially if it has liquid, then for sure there's a problem. If it's a place where it's going to become gas solid. So even on top, even if you're putting it on the top of a pot, if that pot is extremely hot, when you have liquid, you can't do it either. Yeah. Remember the famous rule on Shabbat, whatever you can't do, you can't ask a goy to do. Except for those exceptions that we spoke about in medicine. There are sometimes situations where you can use a Shabbos goy to do certain, that's what a Shabbos goy is, right? You do certain things that are midelabanan, or if it's choler she'en bo sakana, you could use him to do a doraita, sick person.
You see so much hell, it's so hot, vacation, it's so hot, and then the day will go turn that over, it's so warm.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we speak about the halachot of what you can tell a goy to do or not to do. Just because people do it doesn't mean it's permissible. So you can't tell a goy just to do anything.
You don't say do, you say this.
It makes no difference. It makes a difference how you say it. Unless what you're saying is not a real prohibition, then it might help to do it with shinui. It might help to tell a goy directly. Right, eventually we'll talk about it. But it's not so simple. It has to be a situation where one is allowed to tell a goy, depending what's involved. You can't just assume, well, I'm not telling it to him clearly and directly. No, that doesn't really help the matter that much. Right. There are situations where you can't. Right? There are situations where it's permissible. Somebody has a flu. He's sick in bed. You can tell a goy, he's making some chicken soup. And there's two problems with that. You're telling a goy to do melachan Shabbat, and it's bishul akum maybe.
Yes.
You're not allowed to have a goy cook food for you, certain food items. But for a choler she'en bo sakana, meaning that he's not dangerously ill, but he's ill, you're allowed to use a goy even for melacha d'oraita. So there's certain times that you're allowed to use it for the rabbanan, certain times for the d'oraita, but not all the time. So you have to know what those times are. Yeah, eventually, sure. That's one of the things that will come in Shabbat too. Amira le'akum, what you can tell a goy to do. Okay, the last item is hasmana, which many people are not familiar with, that exists on Shabbat. Hasmana means to insulate food. In the olden days, they wanted to preserve the food, make it warm, to keep it warm. They didn't want to leave it on top of the stove, because if it was outside, it would cool off, it was uncovered. They would be matmin, they would put it into sand. They would put it into various materials, all sorts of things. They would put it and cover it around. That would preserve the heat, or not only will it preserve, depending on the material used, it would even increase the heat and cook it. That's called hasmana. You can't do that on Shabbat, and you cannot even do some of it before Shabbat. There's two types of hasmana. One is called, I'll explain, one is called mosif hevel, and one is called sheno mosif hevel. There are certain things that increase the heat, certain things that do not increase, they only preserve the heat. Okay? Two forms of hasmana. On Shabbat, you cannot do hasmana even if it's not mosif hevel. It does not increase the heat. Before Shabbat, you cannot do hasmana if it's mosif hevel. If what you're doing, the action that you're taking right now, will increase the heat. Even though it's before Shabbat, the problem with hasmana is that from this action you may come to do a real melacha on Shabbat, like bishul or mav'ir. If you wanted to increase the heat, because you're concerned with the heat, whether it's preserving or increasing it, warming it up, from this action that you're doing, you may come to do the real melacha of the oraita, which is a sur d'oraita. That is why the rabbis decreed that you cannot do hasmana. Now, depending on what it is, if it's before Shabbat or on Shabbat. If it's on Shabbat, they said only something which is on Shabbat. They said even something which is lo mosif hevel is a sur. Before Shabbat, they prohibited only something which is mosif hevel. So let's give a few examples. But before we give a few examples, these are the conditions that you have to have in order to transgress hasmana. In other words, hasmana is not always prohibited. It depends how it's done, with what you're using, what materials you're using, and how you're covering. It basically means to insulate or cover the pot or the food in materials which will either preserve the heat or increase the heat. So condition number one, in order for it to be considered hasmana, is that it has to be covered from all the sides. Now, let's give examples. Towel, putting a towel all around it. Okay? It has to be in the original keli. Number 2. Number 3, your intention has to be to preserve the heat. And number 4, the cover that you're putting around has to touch the food or the keli. So let's give an example, a towel. Before Shabbat, if you took off if the pot is on the flame, or the urn of water, you cannot cover it completely with a towel. Because even though that towel in itself, that material does not increase heat, because the food item is on the fire, the combination of fire and towels will increase the heat. It has the effect of increasing the heat. You cannot even do that before Shabbat. Now let's say you remove it from the flame. You remove it from the flame before Shabbat. Now you want to cover it. You can't do it before Shabbat because all you're doing is preserving the heat before Shabbat. If you remove it on Shabbat, now you want to preserve the heat, you can't do it. You see what I mean? Hot potato, you want to put it in aluminum foil to preserve the heat. You can't do it. You cannot completely cover it with aluminum foil. How can you do it? Don't completely cover it. You want to put a towel before Shabbat or even on Shabbat? Don't cover it completely. Just on top. So, it doesn't escape the heat or whatever. Fine. You cannot completely envelop the food or the pot before Shabbat, if it's on the fire, or on Shabbat too, makes no difference. Right? Kli Rishon, if it's in the second, let's say it's a cup of tea, or it's not the original keli. Now you want to cover it completely. That's okay because it's not the original keli. Or let's say you want to put the cover, the lid, because you want to protect the food. Your intention is not to preserve the heat, even though that's what it does, the cover. Your intention was just to protect the food. No junk should fall in, no flies. That would be permissible. And it has to be completely enveloping. If it does not completely envelop, let's say you have something on top of the pot, and you put the towel on top of that tray, and it's covering all around, but it's not touching the pot or the food, then it's not completely enveloping it, then that's okay. See what I mean? So this is sometimes a problem, especially if you're using towels or aluminum foil, or you're putting something into something else, and it will be fully surrounded or covered with heat, which may increase it or even preserve it. It would be a asur to do on Shabbat. Yeah, or even before Shabbat, if it increases the heat. If your act increases the heat, has the effect of increasing the heat, it will be even a asur to do before Shabbat. So this may not be too common, but you should be aware of it, because perhaps some people like to use towels or like to use things that are similar to this, whether it's around a food item or whether it's around a pot. If it falls under this, if it complies with these conditions, it will be a hatmana, and it will be a asur, right? That's okay. Why is that okay? Because it's not covering the entire pot. You see? That's not called hasmana. Right? Because on Shabbat, it would be asur, even if all you're doing is preserving the heat. Right? Something is already hot, you took it off the fire, now all you want to do is preserve it. If it's completely surrounding it, right, and it complies with the other conditions, it touches the food or touches the pot, then it would be asur. Even though it does not increase the heat, all you're doing is preserving the heat. Took it off the flame. You can't do it. If it's before Shabbat, you can't do something which is mosif hevel. In other words, it's increasing the heat. Completely covering it, the fact that it's on the flame, on the fire, that combination of completely covering plus the flame has the effect of increasing the heat. That would not be able. You would not be able to do even before Shabbat. You would have to remove it before Shabbat. In the old days, as I said before, there were various materials, all sorts of wool and the refuse or manure, or all these things have the effect to increase or maintain heat, and people would put the pot in, surround it to preserve the heat. That was asur midrabanan because it may lead to do a melacha